On Thanksgiving, my grandson leaned back in his chair, grinning, and said, "Grandpa, your phone belongs in a museum." It wasn't the words that stung, it was the timing. The plates were still steaming, the cranberry sauce still glistening, the air heavy with that once-a-year warmth that's supposed to wrap a family together. But instead, his voice split the moment in half. For a second, I thought he was joking just with me. Then I heard the giggles. First from him, then from his sister, then from down the table. Even my daughter, my own daughter, turned her head and pressed her napkin to her mouth, pretending it was just a cough. But I caught it. That flicker in her eyes. That quick, shared smile with the others. The old phone sat in front of my plate, screen cracked in a spiderweb of lines that caught the glow from the candles. I'd dropped it years ago on an icy sidewalk, but I'd never replaced it. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. And because I knew what lived inside that little rectangle, something none of them had any idea existed. But tonight, it was just a prop in their comedy show. One of the boys, the middle one, picked it up between two fingers like it might crumble to dust. "I bet you can't even download TikTok on this thing," he said, tossing it back down with a smirk. The table erupted again. Silverware tapped plates. Laughter echoed just a little too long. And in that moment, I became a character in their story. The harmless, old-fashioned grandfather who doesn't get it anymore. I sipped my coffee, the heat a sharp contrast to the cold knot forming in my chest. I kept my eyes on the steam rising from the cup, but my mind drifted elsewhere. To nights, when that same phone was the only light in the room. 2 hours spent at the kitchen table, typing until my wrists ached, chasing an idea no one else believed in. They thought they were looking at the past. They didn't know they were staring straight into the reason they had a future. The youngest one, always braver than polite, leaned across the table. "Grandpa," she said with a grin, "you know there are apps that can tell you what you're supposed to do now? Like for old people?" She laughed before I could answer. And I laughed too, because if I didn't, my silence might give away too much. But deep down, beneath the warmth of the coffee and the hum of the family chatter, a thought settled in my mind like a stone in water. I could end this little joke in seconds. A few taps, one screen, one truth, and the laughter would never return the same way again. But I wasn't going to do it. Not yet. Because sometimes the sweetest justice is letting people underestimate you, until the moment they can't anymore. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. That night, after the plates had been cleared and the laughter had dissolved into the hum of the dishwasher, I sat alone at the far end of the table, running my thumb over the jagged edge of the phone's cracked glass. Their teasing hadn't made me angry, not in the loud, quick-burning way anger works. It had slipped in quieter, deeper, settling into the space between my ribs like a slow frost. They thought they were joking about a piece of outdated technology, but I knew they were laughing at more than a phone. They were laughing at a version of me they believed to be fading, irrelevant. To them, I was someone who had stepped off the train of the world years ago and never bothered to catch another. I could feel that belief in their sideways glances, in the way they returned to their own conversations without looking back at me. It was a subtle rewriting of who I was in their eyes. From the man who once fixed broken bikes in the rain and paid for music lessons when their parents couldn't, to someone quaint, maybe even a little pitiful. And the strange part was, they didn't mean harm. That almost made it worse. They had simply accepted a story about me that wasn't true. And once people accept a story about you, it's hard to make them see anything else. I sat there, tracing memories as if they were etched into that cracked screen. Years ago, this phone had been more than a device. It had been my only tool, my only lifeline, during the quietest and most uncertain nights of my life. The house had been different then. Colder, emptier, the air filled with the small, constant hum of a refrigerator, and the sound of my own typing. Every line of code, every small victory had happened here on this surface of glass that now seemed to them like nothing but a relic. They couldn't see those nights when the glow of the screen was the only light in the room, when the weight of exhaustion and doubt was heavier than the air I breathed. And yet I kept going. It wasn't the crack in the screen that hurt me. It was the crack in the way they saw me. It was a fracture that had been forming quietly, unnoticed over the years as technology changed, as they grew up, as the world moved faster. And tonight, the laughter had widened it just enough for me to feel it, not because I was fragile, but because it showed me how far apart we'd drifted, not in love, but in understanding. The truth is, their world doesn't stop to look back. It's full of screens without scratches, answers that appear in milliseconds, things that can be replaced in a day. My world, the one that built theirs, was slower, heavier, stitched together by persistence and the stubborn refusal to give up, when giving up would have been easier. That's the part they can't see when they look at this phone. And maybe, until tonight, I didn't want them to. But that small fracture in their view of me, the one they don't even know exists, will matter more than they think, because fractures can grow. And some of them, I intend to widen myself. Later that evening, the house had thinned to small pockets of conversation. Some were in the living room, where the TV murmured under the weight of post-dinner drowsiness. Others lingered near the front door, gathering coats and swapping promises to meet again soon. I'd wandered into the kitchen, half to rinse my coffee cup, half to let the quiet find me. The overhead light was softer here, casting long shadows across the counter. That's when I heard it. Not meant for me. Not loud enough to carry beyond the doorway, but clear enough to find its mark. "Grandpa probably doesn't even understand the internet," my oldest grandson said, his voice somewhere between casual and certain. His sister laughed, that small, sharp sound of agreement that didn't need words. They weren't mocking with malice. There was no venom in it. But there was something else, a kind of finality, the way you might speak about someone who could never change. I stood by the sink, my hand tightening around the ceramic mug, the faint clink of porcelain against porcelain breaking the stillness for just a moment. I didn't step into the doorway. I didn't clear my throat or correct them. I just stood there, letting their words settle like dust. Mornings of teaching myself new code, nights spent reading through endless lines of documentation, the stubborn hours where frustration threatened to drown me, but I stayed with it until something finally clicked. All of it, erased in their minds by the story they decided was true, that I belonged to an older world, sealed off from theirs. The thing about silence is that it can feel like surrender to the one who wields it, but I've learned it can also be a shield, a way to let someone's assumptions stand just long enough for the truth to have maximum impact when it finally arrives. I let the hum of the refrigerator fill the gap where I might have spoken. I kept my back to them, staring into the mug as if the swirl of coffee at the bottom might tell me something I didn't already know. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about proving them wrong just to win a point. I was thinking about the long game, the way a seed planted in darkness eventually pushes its way toward the light, surprising even those who thought the soil was barren. They believed I didn't understand the world they lived in. What they didn't know was that I had helped build a piece of it, one they had walked across countless times without ever realizing whose hands had laid the stones. So I rinsed the mug, set it carefully in the drying rack, and let the moment pass. Not because their words hadn't landed, but because some truths are best delivered when the person receiving them has no shield left. I would wait, and when the time came, the silence they thought was weakness would be the very thing that made the truth hit harder. That first notification is burned into my memory, the way some people remember their wedding vows or the cry of a newborn. It was late, later than I should have been awake, the kind of hour when the rest of the house felt like it had fallen off the map. My eyes were gritty from staring at the small glow of the screen for too many hours, and my fingers ached from the repetitive, almost mechanical tapping. And then it came. A soft vibration. A chime I had customized weeks earlier and almost forgotten. On the lock screen, 4 words appeared that changed everything. New user registered today. It was absurd how much it moved me. One person, one. I didn't know their name, where they were from, what they looked like, only that they had stumbled into something I had built with my own hands and chosen to stay. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the tiny message, as if it might fade if I looked away. In that moment, the exhaustion that had been chewing at the edges of my determination seemed to lift. The kitchen didn't feel so empty. The night didn't feel so long. I had built something that had reached someone, and that was enough to keep going. In the days that followed, there were more. Slowly at first, a trickle that barely disturbed the quiet of my inbox. 10 users, 20, then 100. I began to see patterns, little ripples in the data that hinted at growth, but it wasn't just numbers to me. Every new registration was a person somewhere in the world whose life had intersected, however briefly, with mine. It was a strange and humbling thought, that my life's work might live quietly in their pocket, that they might use it in line at a grocery store, or on a bus, or in a moment of stillness before bed. Of course, no one around me knew. Why would they? It wasn't the kind of thing you announce at family dinners, especially when those dinners were filled with stories of new jobs, new houses, new babies. My news felt invisible in comparison, and maybe I liked it that way. There's a kind of safety in building something quietly, without the pressure of an audience waiting for you to succeed or fail. Still, I remember one evening when the temptation to share almost broke me. My daughter had called to ask for advice on paying for a summer program the kids wanted to attend. She was worried about the cost, about stretching too thin. I had already run the numbers in my head, already knew my little app had made enough to cover it twice over, but I didn't tell her. I sent the money anonymously, through a method that would make it look like it came from a scholarship fund. She thanked me for pointing her toward that resource, never guessing I was the resource. The truth was I didn't need them to know. Not yet. In fact, I think part of me enjoyed the irony, that they carried in their pockets the very thing they assumed I could never understand. That somewhere, without them realizing it, my fingerprints were already on their daily lives. Years later, when my cracked phone sat on that Thanksgiving table like a punchline to a joke, I thought of that first notification. I thought of how much had grown from that single unseen seed, and I knew with a calm certainty that the day would come when I would turn the phone around, let them see the world inside it, and watch their laughter turn into something else entirely. It was early morning, the kind of pale, uncertain light that seeps through the curtains before the sun commits to the day. I hadn't gone to bed the night before. The hours had slipped past unnoticed, my focus narrowed to the glow of the phone, the soft rhythm of tapping, scrolling, editing, checking. I was deep in the middle of debugging a stubborn piece of code when the sound came. A soft vibration against the wooden table. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another reminder or some irrelevant notification. But when I glanced down, the words seemed to freeze the air around me. New user registered. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting the letters sink in. Not a test account, not me trying out the sign-up form again. A real person, somewhere out there in a place I couldn't see or imagine, had stumbled upon the thing I had built in the quiet hours of countless nights and decided to step inside. They didn't know me, my face, my name. They didn't care that my office was a kitchen table with a cup of stale coffee at its center. All they knew was that the app worked well enough for them to choose it, and in that simple act, they had turned my private experiment into something alive. It's strange how one small sign can shift the weight of everything. Until that moment, it had been just me pushing an idea uphill, carrying it through fatigue and self-doubt. But now, there was another pair of footsteps on that hill. Invisible, but real. My chest felt light in a way it hadn't in years, like the air had finally found its way back into corners it had abandoned. I remember sitting back in my chair, closing my eyes, and smiling into the silence. The next few days I checked obsessively, once in the morning, again at lunch, then in the middle of the night, as if someone might join while the rest of the world was asleep, and slowly the number grew. 2 users, 3, a handful, then a small burst after I made a change to the interface. Each time the phone buzzed, I felt the same quiet astonishment, the same reminder that I wasn't shouting into the void. Someone was listening. I didn't tell anyone. Not my daughter, not my friends, not even the people who might have understood the magnitude of what was happening. It wasn't time. The project still felt too delicate, like a bird that had only just learned to balance on a branch. The wrong kind of attention could scare it off before it learned to fly. So I guarded it, kept it close, and let it grow under the shelter of my silence. Looking back now, I realize how much that first notification meant. It wasn't just about a user. It was about validation that the hours I'd stolen from sleep, the sacrifices I'd made, weren't just for my own stubborn pride. There was someone on the other side of the world, holding their own phone, and through a string of code and a moment of curiosity, we were connected. Years later, when my family laughed at the cracked screen, I thought of that day. The morning when the world outside my kitchen had finally reached back. And I knew, even as they dismissed the phone as outdated junk, that inside it lived a history they couldn't begin to imagine. The first offer came in the form of an email that looked almost accidental, a plain subject line, no polished signature, just a few sentences from someone claiming to represent a small but ambitious tech company. They had seen my app, they said, and thought it had potential. The word potential sat there like bait, as if they were doing me a kindness by recognizing something I had been pouring myself into for years. The number they offered wasn't insulting on paper, but it wasn't worthy either. It was the kind of amount meant to tempt someone who had built something out of curiosity, and would happily hand it over for the thrill of a quick payout. I read the message twice, then a third time, my thumb hovering over the screen as if pressing reply might erase the work I had done. They framed it as an opportunity. Sell now, take the cash, let them take it to the next level. But I knew what that meant. I had seen it happen before. Small projects, swallowed by larger machines, stripped of their original character, repainted with someone else's colors, and ultimately abandoned when the profit didn't meet the forecast. My app would become just another forgotten link in a chain of acquisitions. Its heartbeat stopped in the name of efficiency. I sat with the offer for days. Not because I was tempted by the money, but because I wanted to be sure my refusal came from clarity, not pride. I thought about the nights at the kitchen table, the ache in my hands from typing through the cold, the way that first user had made the hours worth it. I thought about the small but steady stream of registrations that had followed, about the subtle improvements I'd made week after week. Selling would mean handing all of that over to strangers who had never felt the weight of starting from nothing. A few months later, another offer arrived, this one with more polish, more zeros. They had run the numbers, they said, and believed they could scale quickly. They would even keep me on as a consultant, which I knew was just a polite way of saying they wanted my ideas without my presence. I imagined my work folded into some massive corporate app, my name erased from the credits, my voice gone from its design. So I declined again, politely, quietly, and when they pressed, I told them the truth. This wasn't just code on a screen for me. It was proof that I could still build something new with my own hands, that I could still matter in a world that moved faster than I could run. I didn't care if it grew slowly. I didn't care if it took years to reach the height they promised in months. What mattered was that it stayed mine until I was ready to let it go. There's a kind of dignity in tending something you've built without rushing it to market. In a way, my app was like the garden I used to keep behind the house, the one I refused to pave over, even when it would have been easier to build a patio. You don't sell a garden just because someone else says they can grow the plants faster. You keep it, you work it. You let it feed the people you love. Years later, when my grandchildren laughed at my phone, they didn't know that it wasn't just a relic I was stubbornly hanging on to. It was a living record of every refusal, every moment I'd chosen the long road over the shortcut. And that choice, as slow, as quiet, as unremarkable as it might have seemed, was the reason the app was still alive when so many others had vanished. The growth came like the changing of seasons, not with a single announcement or a sudden transformation, but in the slow, almost invisible shifts you only notice when you look back. While my days seemed ordinary to everyone else, the quiet machinery of my little project was turning, building, moving forward without fanfare. In the mornings, I would patch the fence in the backyard, the cold biting at my fingers, and later, while my coffee steamed on the kitchen table, I would check the dashboard. The numbers were never dramatic, just a few more users, a few more cents in revenue. But they never went backward. Every day, there was a little more than there had been the day before. To my family, I was simply living out the rituals of an older man, reading the paper in the same chair by the window, stacking logs by the shed before winter settled in, nodding off in the armchair after dinner. They saw no reason to look closer, no hint that behind the calm rhythm of my routines, a different world was unfolding quietly through the cracked glass of my phone. They didn't see the late nights when I refined a feature that had been nagging at me for weeks, or the small thrill of seeing a user from another country register for the first time. They didn't know how many tiny victories were hiding in the silence between their visits. The income was modest at first, enough to cover the cost of hosting, then enough to make the electricity bill disappear from my list of worries. Then it began to stack in the background, month by month, like snow accumulating on the eaves. I didn't touch most of it. I let it sit, grow, breathe on its own. It felt almost like tending a secret orchard, one they walked past without knowing the fruit was ripening just beyond their sight. Sometimes I would be outside splitting firewood, the sharp crack of the axe ringing into the still air, and my phone would buzz in my pocket. Another registration, another small payment. The contrast always struck me. The physical weight of the wood in my hands, the smell of sap and cold air, paired with the invisible work happening somewhere far away, in places I would likely never see. Both worlds felt real to me. Both worlds belonged to me. It was a kind of satisfaction that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I didn't need applause or recognition. The growth was mine to watch, mine to protect. And perhaps that was the greatest gift, that in a family where people often rushed to share every achievement, I had something that was entirely mine, unfolding on its own timeline, answering to no one but me. When I think back on those years, I realize that the quietness of that growth was its greatest strength. No one tried to interfere. No one pushed me to change it into something it wasn't. It simply became what it was meant to be, not in a hurry, not for show, but in the steady way that strong things grow. Years later, when I would finally lift my phone and show them what had been hiding in plain sight, they would look back on these years and wonder how they missed it. But I would remember every fence repaired, every log stacked, every quiet morning spent reading the paper while, unseen, my little project kept breathing and growing right under their noses. It was a rainy afternoon when the call came from my daughter. Her voice carried that careful tone she used when she didn't want to sound worried, but couldn't hide it completely. The semester for my grandson was starting soon, and the tuition bill had arrived. Heavier than she'd expected. She had been looking into options, applying for small grants, considering part-time work, and asking around about scholarships. She spoke about it as if it were a logistical problem to be solved, but I could hear the tension tucked between her sentences, the way her breaths came a little too quickly. I listened quietly, making the occasional sound of understanding, letting her speak. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the money was already there, sitting in an account I rarely touched, the result of countless nights of work, quiet mornings at the kitchen table, and years of refusing to let go of what I had built. The app had reached the point where the income was no longer just covering bills or sitting in reserve. It could do more now. It could matter in ways no one would suspect. That night, after the conversation ended, I opened my phone. The rain was still tapping gently against the window, the kitchen lit only by the glow of the screen in my hand. I logged into the account, scrolled past the history of small but steady earnings, and initiated the transfer. I knew exactly how much to send, down to the cent. enough to cover the semester completely, including the small fees they always forget to mention until the end. I made sure it came from an anonymous channel, one labeled as a private educational grant. When I pressed send, there was no rush of adrenaline, no sudden flood of triumph. Instead, there was a deep, quiet satisfaction, the kind that fills you slowly, the way warm light seeps into a cold room. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that something I had built in secrecy, something they assumed I could never create, was now opening doors for them without them even knowing it. A few days later, my daughter called again. Her voice was lighter this time, almost incredulous. She said the school had informed them that a private fund had stepped in to cover the tuition. "We must have filled out something I don't remember," she said, laughing softly. "Lucky break, I guess." I smiled into the phone, said I was glad to hear it, and left it at that. They celebrated that evening without me, calling it a blessing, raising their glasses to luck and kindness from strangers. They didn't know that the stranger was sitting in his quiet kitchen, sipping tea, and reading over new registrations that had come in that day. They didn't know that the cracked phone they had laughed at not long ago had just paid for an education, just changed a path, just ensured a future. And I didn't tell them. Not because I needed to keep the secret for my own pride, but because I wanted them to live in the gift without the weight of owing me thanks. Gratitude changes relationships. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted them to have the freedom to walk forward, believing they had been given a chance, not realizing that the chance had been growing line by line in the palm of my hand for years. That night, as the rain slowed and the air turned still, I set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a long time. They saw a relic. I saw a bridge, and quietly I promised myself it wouldn't be the last time it carried someone I loved across to the other side. Silence can be a gift, but it can also be a weight. After the tuition was paid, and the excitement in their voices faded into the ordinary rhythm of the days, I found myself thinking about the thin line I was walking. I could have told them. I could have revealed the truth in a way that would have surprised them, maybe even moved them. They might have thanked me. They might have looked at me differently, with respect instead of amusement. But I also knew how quickly gratitude can erode into expectation. The moment someone sees you as the source, they begin to imagine the flow will never stop, and before long the gift is no longer a blessing, it is an obligation. I had seen it before, in other families. A single act of generosity that opened the door to more requests, subtle at first, then bolder. A helping hand becomes a crutch, and eventually the person offering it is not thanked but taken for granted. I didn't want that. I didn't want them to measure me in dollars and transactions, to see my worth only in the ways I could fill their gaps. I wanted them to be proud of me for what I had built, for the persistence that had shaped it, for the quiet courage it had taken to keep going when no one thought I could. Not for the size of a transfer in their bank account. There was also something fragile about the anonymity. It allowed them to feel they had received something from the world, not just from me. A gift from a faceless source can be seen as fortune, as proof that the world is sometimes kind. If I took that mask off, the magic would change shape. Instead of marveling at the luck of a grant, they might simply shrug and think, "Grandpa took care of it." And that thought, as warm as it might seem, would quietly shift the way they saw me. So I kept the secret. I let them believe the story they had been told, that some generous fund had stepped in, and in doing so I protected not only the way they saw me, but the way they saw themselves. They could walk with their heads high, thinking they had earned their place, thinking the world had noticed and rewarded them. That belief would give them a kind of confidence no check from me ever could. But silence has a cost. It meant that when they laughed at my phone, they laughed at the very tool that had just given them an opportunity they might never have had otherwise. It meant that when they dismissed me as out of touch, they did so without realizing they were standing on ground I had quietly paved. I carried that truth alone, not bitterly, but with the kind of ache you get from holding something heavy for a long time, a weight you choose to bear because letting it go would change the shape of everything around you. In my quiet moments, I would look at the phone and feel both pride and a kind of loneliness. Pride in the work, in the independence, in the patience it took to let it grow. Loneliness in knowing that the story of what I had done lived only with me. Sometimes I wondered if that was the real price of my silence. Not that they didn't know what I had done for them, but that they didn't know who I truly was anymore. It happened again. Only this time there was no mistaking the volume or the intent. The room was brighter, the table fuller, the air charged with the kind of holiday energy that makes people speak a little louder and laugh a little longer than they should. Plates clinked, glasses were refilled, and somewhere between the roast being passed and the dessert plates being set down, the conversation shifted to me, or rather, to the object in my pocket. One of the younger cousins started it, glancing at my phone as I checked the time. "You know what we should do?" he said, his voice carrying across the table. "We should all chip in and get Grandpa a normal phone for Christmas, so he doesn't embarrass himself anymore." The laughter that followed was immediate and unrestrained, rising in waves from one end of the table to the other. Even those who didn't know the full context laughed simply because everyone else was. It was the kind of laughter that isn't aimed to wound, yet still finds its way deep into you. I nodded, a practiced smile tugging at the corner of my mouth, the one I've used for years to deflect moments like this. I even made a small gesture as if to say, "Maybe you're right." But inside, something stirred. Not the sharp sting of humiliation, but a slow, deliberate heat that began to spread through me. It wasn't about the phone anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This was about the picture they had painted of me, and how comfortable they had become in hanging it on the wall without ever asking if it was accurate. As the conversation moved on, my mind didn't. I thought about the path from the first line of code to the latest deposit into that untouched account. I thought about the tuition that had been covered, the opportunities that had been opened, all without a word spoken or a thank you sought. I thought about the hours they'd never seen, the ones spent in the dim light of the kitchen with that very phone in my hands, the one they now dismissed as a relic. Their voices blurred into background noise as I watched their faces, each one illuminated by the warm glow of the chandelier. I saw no malice there, only ignorance. And in some ways that was worse, because when people underestimate you without meaning to, it means the truth has been hidden for so long they can no longer imagine it exists. I didn't say anything. Not then. Not yet. I let them laugh, let the moment run its course, because I knew something they didn't. The reveal was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't be about shaming them or demanding an apology. It would be about holding up a mirror to their assumptions and letting them see just how wrong they had been. I sat back, my hands folded loosely in my lap, the hum of conversation returning to food and travel plans. But beneath the surface, the decision was already made. The quiet patience that had carried me through years of building in secret had a new purpose now. The day they would see, really see, was closer than they realized. And when that day came, the laughter would stop, not because I asked it to, but because the truth would leave no room for it. It was a mild spring afternoon when my grandson pulled up in front of the house, the sun glinting off a car so new it still carried the faint scent of the showroom. I was sitting on the porch, mending a loose board on the railing, when I heard the low, confident purr of the engine. He stepped out, his face lit with the kind of pride you don't try to hide, tossing the keys in the air and catching them with a little flourish. He didn't come just to show me the car, or at least that's what he said, but it didn't take long for the conversation to drift there. He leaned against the hood, talking about the model, the upgrades, the deals he'd managed to get. But what he really wanted to talk about wasn't the car itself. It was the life it represented. "This," he said, running a hand over the smooth paint, "is what happens when you get the right education. I couldn't have done it without the degree, and I couldn't have gotten that degree without, you know, the fund." He grinned, almost sheepishly, and added, "Guess I owe that mysterious Grant a drink." Then he winked, as if the two of us were in on the same joke. I smiled, but it felt different inside. He didn't know that the fund was sitting on the porch in front of him, wearing a faded shirt and work gloves, pretending to care about the weather while holding back a truth big enough to rewrite the last few years of his life. He didn't know that every mile he'd driven in that car so far was paved, in some small way, by the nights I'd spent hunched over a glowing screen while the rest of the world slept. He didn't know that the cracked phone he'd once laughed at had quietly handed him the keys he was now twirling so casually. There was a strange ache in that moment, pride and distance tangled together. I was proud of him for working hard enough to make the most of what he'd been given, proud that he hadn't squandered the opportunity. But I also felt the deep, unspoken gap between us, the one carved out by my choice to stay silent. I had given him something life-changing, yet he believed it had come from a faceless organization, a piece of luck dropped into his path by the universe. And maybe that was for the best. Luck is easier to accept than a debt you can never repay. As he talked about plans for the summer, about trips he wanted to take and projects he wanted to start, I found myself watching his hands, steady, certain, free of the kind of tension I used to carry. This was what I had wanted for him, a life that didn't require him to count every dollar before making a choice, a life with room for possibility. And I had managed to give it to him without him even knowing it had come from me. But as he got back into the car and drove away, I realized something else. The satisfaction of anonymity had begun to feel different. Not less, exactly, but sharper, edged with the awareness that this secrecy, once protective, was also keeping us apart in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was thanking a stranger for something that had come from my hands, my nights, my stubborn refusal to give up. And while I didn't need the credit, a part of me longed for him to know. Not so he could feel indebted, but so he could see me, really see me, for who I still was. The porch grew quiet again, save for the faint ticking of the cooling engine fading down the street. I set the hammer down beside me, my gaze drifting to the phone in my pocket. The same phone he'd once joked belonged in a museum. The same phone that had built the bridge between his education and that car, now carrying him toward his future. The day I showed him the truth was coming. I could feel it in my bones. It happened on a day that looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of gathering we'd had dozens of times before. The family was spread across the living room, voices overlapping in that familiar chaos that always seemed to precede dinner. My phone was in my pocket, heavy not from its weight, but from the years it carried inside it. For so long, I had kept its truth tucked away like a letter never mailed. But that day, something in me shifted. Maybe it was the memory of their laughter, or the way my grandson had thanked a ghost for something I had given him, or maybe it was simply that the time for patience had run its course. They were talking about finances, of all things, about how lucky some people were to land a good grant, to find the right opportunities at the right moment. I sat there, listening, feeling the familiar ache of distance, and then, without planning it, I reached into my pocket. The room didn't notice at first. My thumb slid across the glass, waking up the screen, the familiar map of cracks spreading under my touch. I opened the app. The logo appeared, the one I had designed in those long, quiet nights when no one else was awake. Below it, the numbers began to load, the live user count, the activity statistics, the history of transactions. And then the one figure that always seemed unreal, even to me, the total earnings, the sum that had quietly crossed into 7 digits months ago. More than 6 zeros staring back at me in bold, unblinking text. I turned the phone toward them. At first, no one reacted. They glanced at it the way you glance at someone showing you a weather forecast. Then their eyes sharpened. Their conversations faltered. One by one, they leaned in, drawn by the stillness that had fallen over the room. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that feels solid, like you could reach out and touch it. My daughter's brow furrowed as if she was trying to solve a puzzle without enough pieces. My grandson's eyes moved from the numbers to my face, then back to the numbers, as if he couldn't quite make them fit into the same reality. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the space, the recognition that the phone they had dismissed, the one they had laughed at, was not a relic at all. I didn't explain right away. I let them sit with it. Let them see the scale of what had been hidden in plain sight all these years. Let them feel the weight of the fact that while they had been busy underestimating me, I had been building something big enough to change lives. Their lives. The room stayed suspended in that moment, breaths caught, eyes locked. For the first time in years, they weren't looking at the phone. They were looking at me. Not the version of me they had grown comfortable with, but the man who had refused to sell his work for quick cash, who had quietly used it to open doors for them, who had kept building long after they had stopped watching. I didn't need to say the words. The truth was right there, glowing on the cracked glass between us. And I could feel the laughter of the past years folding in on itself, replaced by something far heavier, far more lasting. Respect. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, until I could see in their eyes that the numbers on the screen had stopped being just numbers and had begun to turn into questions. Questions about time, about effort, about how something this big could have been living in the shadows while they went about their lives. I closed my fingers around the phone, not to hide it, but to feel the weight of it, the same weight I had carried for years. Then I began. Slowly at first, like opening a box that had been sealed for a long time. I told them about the nights in the kitchen when the rest of the house was asleep, the light from the phone, my only lamp, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound that kept me company. I spoke about learning the language of code one line at a time, stumbling through errors that would have sent a less stubborn man to bed. I told them how I built the first version of the app in the quiet, with nothing but the determination to see if I could make it work. They listened without interrupting. The same faces that had once laughed at my museum piece were now still, eyes fixed on me. I described how each button they would see, if they opened the app, was drawn by my own hand, each feature tested and broken and rebuilt until it held together. I spoke of the first user, how a single notification had kept me awake the rest of that night, heart pounding, realizing that the thing I had built had reached another human being somewhere in the world. Then I told them about the growth, how it had come quietly, almost invisibly, while I repaired fences, stacked firewood, and read my morning paper, how the revenue had started as a trickle and turned into something steady enough to matter. And then I told them what I had done with it. I told them about the tuition payment, how it had been sent without a name, arriving in their inbox under the title of a private educational grant. I told them about the books for courses, the fees for housing, the little extras that had made life easier, all quietly covered while they believed it was luck or kindness from strangers. I didn't list the amounts. I didn't need to. I just told them why I had done it, because I wanted them to move forward without feeling the weight of debt, without seeing me as a bank, without turning my love into a transaction. As I spoke, I could feel the years collapsing between us, the nights they had never seen, the decisions I had made in silence, the reasons I had chosen to keep it hidden. My grandson's jaw tightened as he stared at the floor, the car keys in his pocket suddenly not feeling so light. My daughter's eyes glistened, though she didn't speak. Even the younger ones, who had been too young to notice much of anything back then, were leaning forward, caught in the gravity of the story. When I finished, I didn't expect applause or a flood of thank yous. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was for them to see me, not as the old man with the outdated phone, but as the person who had fought, learned, and built something from nothing. The man who had stayed up in the dark not for his own comfort, but for theirs. And in that room, in that long-waited silence after my words ended, I knew they finally did. The words had left my mouth, but the air in the room still felt full, as if they hadn't landed yet, as if they were hovering above us, settling grain by grain. No one moved. No one reached for a glass or shifted in their seat. It was the kind of stillness you don't plan for. It just arrives, uninvited, and makes its home in the space where noise used to be. The quiet wasn't awkward. It wasn't the silence of people searching for the right platitude. It was heavier, more deliberate. It was the weight of something too large to be wrapped in quick responses. I could see it in their faces, the recalculation, the rewinding of memories. I imagined them running back through the moments when they had laughed at my phone, at my habits, at what they thought was my small, outdated life, and seeing them differently now. The oldest grandson, the one who had joked the loudest over the years, was the first to break in small ways. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He just lowered his gaze, the shine of confidence in his eyes replaced with something quieter, something that looked a lot like shame. His hands were still, his shoulders drawn in, as though shrinking under the realization of what he'd missed. The youngest, barely old enough to remember the years I'd been building in silence, slid closer without a word. Her small hand found mine, fingers curling around it with the natural trust only a child has. She didn't know the full scope of what had just been revealed, but she knew enough to feel the shift in the room. Her touch was warm, steady, the kind of simple, wordless connection that cuts through every layer of misunderstanding. I didn't rush to fill the space, I let the silence stay. It had its own truth to tell, and sometimes truth works best when left alone. In that pause, they were forced to see me without the crutch of assumptions or the noise of their own voices. They saw the years I'd carried the work quietly, the choice to give without being seen, the quiet discipline it took to keep building when there was no applause to chase. No one reached for their phone. No one tried to make a joke to lighten the mood. We just sat there, each of us in the same room, but wandering through our own private reckoning. For me, it wasn't about victory. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about this, the recognition that sometimes the loudest answer to underestimation isn't a speech or a performance. It's simply the truth, laid bare, and the silence that follows when people have no choice but to listen. And in that silence, the air between us felt different, not fixed, not mended in a single moment, but altered in a way that couldn't be undone. They would never look at me, or my phone, the same way again. I let the phone rest in my hand for a moment longer, the screen still glowing, the numbers still staring back as if they too understood the weight of being seen. Then, slowly I pressed the button, and the light faded into black. It was almost ceremonial, the closing of a chapter I had been writing for years in silence. My gaze moved around the room from one face to another, and I felt something shift in the way they looked back at me. There was no more squinting at the cracks in my screen, no sideways glances at the outdated casing. They weren't seeing the phone anymore. They were seeing me. I leaned back slightly, my voice calm, steady, carrying in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be raised to be heard. "It doesn't matter what phone you use to call," I said, the words settling into the space like stones into still water. "What matters is that you call the people who have done something for you." I didn't point at anyone. I didn't single out the grandson whose education had been paid for, or the daughter whose worries I'd quietly eased. The sentence wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder, not just to them, but to myself, of what really counts when the noise falls away. They didn't respond right away. There was no chorus of apologies, no dramatic rush to explain themselves. Instead, there was something far rarer, the kind of silence that means the message has landed in a place words can't reach. I saw it in the way my grandson's jaw loosened, in the way my daughter's eyes lingered on mine, longer than they had in years, in the way even the youngest sat still, as though holding on to something too important to drop. And then, quietly, life began to move again. Someone reached for their drink. A fork scraped softly against a plate. The moment didn't dissolve. It just folded itself into the air between us, something we all carried now, whether we spoke of it again or not. In the weeks that followed, nothing obvious changed, but everything felt different. The next time we gathered, they didn't joke about my phone. In fact, when I set it down on the table, I caught my grandson glancing at it with something I hadn't seen before: respect. A small smile tugged at his mouth, not mocking, but almost proud, as if he now knew a secret the rest of the world didn't. My daughter, when leaving that night, rested her hand on my shoulder just a moment longer than necessary, her grip warm and sure. The phone itself didn't change. The cracks were still there, the case still worn, the weight still the same in my pocket. But to them, it was no longer a relic. It was a testament. Every time they saw it, they didn't see outdated technology. They saw nights they hadn't known about, choices I had made when no one was watching, a stubborn faith in something that began as nothing and became enough to change their lives. And as for me, I found that I no longer minded the years of misunderstanding, the jokes, the assumptions, because in the end, the truth had its moment, and that moment was enough to rewrite the way they saw me, not with noise or applause, but with something that lasts far longer, quiet, unshakable respect. Now when my phone rings, they don't see the cracks. They see the bridge it built. And that's all I ever wanted.